My name is Sarah Bao, and I did my project on voting rights. So on the right, there's just an image that depicts two women that are basically kind of petitioning for their voting rights, and in the background is a Jim Crow is dead sign, and that just represents the Jim Crow laws being finished and taken care of and just basically wiped out, which were in favor of segregation. So just a little bit of a background on voting rights. So the women's voting rights were granted in 1920 with the 19th Amendment through women's suffrage. So people like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they really helped to get the movement going and to give women the voting rights that they deserved. Voting rights for blacks were gained in 1870 with the 15th Amendment, or at least the majority of the rights were gained in 1870. Basically, they didn't have the right to vote as well, and they were kind of there with the women, but the women had to wait at least 50 years more to gain their voting rights. And basically, it just took so long because of the bias of the people. No one really wanted to stand up for it, and it was a struggle for both women, and it was a struggle for the women and then for the African Americans. So it was really hard, especially for African American women, because the African American men gained their voting rights, but the African American women still had to wait and couldn't gain their voting rights yet. So basically, it was a struggle for both, and they were both groups, the African Americans and the women were viewed as lesser in society. So it was hard for them to speak out because no one was really taking them seriously. And these are just some pictures. So this one basically just says, "We demand voting rights now," and "We demand an end to police brutality." And then the bottom picture is just a bunch of women sitting around with vote signs so that they can kind of petition for their rights. And then this is just a picture from one of my articles, just a screen capture. It says, "The right to vote is both fundamental to individual liberty and to the proper functioning of representative democracy. When voting rights are denied, diluted, or restricted, the ability of government to respond to our challenges and increase our opportunities is impaired, and its legitimacy in doing so is diminished." So the article I read was called "The Voting Rights Umbrella," and it was basically an article that had to do with Bill Clinton. So there were tests that were designed to make it harder for African Americans to gain their voting rights. So these things were like literacy tests, and they were said to be equal and fair when in reality they were not equal or fair. They were basically for African Americans, and they had to take them to determine if they were allowed or eligible to vote. But like I said, they weren't equal or fair. They were kind of like almost like trick tests. And there was years of struggle for African Americans to gain their voting rights. I touched a little bit about women earlier, but from here on out, I'm pretty much just focusing on the African American struggle. So like I said, the literacy tests and providing federal examiners and observers to monitor registration in elections, the number of African Americans registered to vote rose dramatically across the South because of the removal of the exclusionary tactics, which were, like I said, the literacy tests and federal examiners that were there to observe the voting registrations. And there was a steady expansion on the right to vote and just basically rights in general for African Americans. So it wasn't just the rights to vote that they were fighting for, but that was one of their main fights. And by 1968, the percentage of registered African Americans in Mississippi had increased from 6.7 to 59.8, and in Alabama, it went from 19.3 to 51.6, in Louisiana from 31.6 to 58.9. And a common theme in American history is just the steady expansion on the right to vote for African Americans. And also the African Americans that were holding office increased from less than 1,000 to over 10,000 after the removal of these exclusionary tactics. And Florida also, just to touch a little bit more about the women's fight before I end my presentation, Florida forced women voters to close down their operations in their expansions to vote and to gain their voting rights. So that was just a little bit on them. Basically, they were still fighting for their voting rights, and Florida kind of forced women to close down the operations. That's my works cited.